Good morning, everyone, again. I'd like to introduce Chaison from EMC. He's in charge of the V Specialist team. But I got to make a couple more points here. In the back of your book, there are survey questions. If you can rip those out, fill them out, and give them to the front of the desk after each session you go to, each one will get your name put in a drawing for a Kindle Fire and a $50 gift card to Amazon after the event. But with that said, we have Aaron here from EMC. He's the V Specialist team, yep. And I'm going to let Aaron tell you more about what he does and talk about the cloud solutions and what to expect.
All right. So, for those of you guys that don't know me, my name is Aaron Chaison. I've been at EMC for quite a while now, about 13 years. I work on our V Specialist team, which was really designed back in 2007 when we IPO'd VMware to provide sort of a technical overlay group between the two organizations around our joint solutions and go-to-market. Today, I am not going to be at all talking about that, however. What I'm going to be talking to you guys about today is a little bit more about the context of what's happening in the industry and what a lot of IT people within IT organizations need to think about with the emergence of these Googlezons, this world of these Uber clouds that are starting to emerge. And what does that mean for IT? What does that mean for the industry? What does that mean for people that are working in the industry and what they need to keep in mind? With my team, I usually try once a year to bring them in and have a meeting that I usually call that the focus is really around context. Not so much about the technical components of what it is that we're doing in the market, but more understanding what's driving a lot of the technology that's emerging right now. Because a lot of us have time to learn and to read blogs and to read books and maybe get some hands-on some equipment here and there. But it's important to understand the context in which those tools have been designed to really be able to grasp those ideas. So the three themes of this real conversation here is around, oh, by the way, you got to stay up to date with all the stuff. I'm trying to drive a trending around this Googlezon thing. So if you want to tweet about it, feel free. But the three key themes of my session are going to be context. First of all, what is it that's happening out there? What do we need to be thinking about or keeping our brains wrapped around when we're looking at these emerging cloud and virtualization technologies? Choices. All right, so once I understand kind of what's happening, what are the choices out there that I can pick from as far as technologies and cloud choices and options to pick from? And then finally, actions. What do I do? So once I've picked the model and picked the solution I want to go out there, what are the things I need to think about and start doing now to start preparing for where my IT infrastructure or where my IT department is going to be going? So with all that said, I need to kind of start with the context, right? And you got to have the requisite cloud slide. Almost every deck these days needs to have a picture of a cloud in it. So the idea here with this one is to say, we've been talking about clouds now for probably going on about 4 or 5 years, right? The idea of clouds kind of came out in 2006 as a way of explaining the difference between virtualized data centers that had been built out over most of those sort of previous 5 to 10 years and this emerging change towards more of a delivery model versus the physical things that you're buying and assembling, right? So virtual data centers are servers and networks and storage and hypervisors and applications running on those things. And it's all about consolidation ratios and efficiencies and mostly CapEx stuff. What shifted it towards those clouds about 5, 6 years ago was saying, hey, how do I take these new IT models of infrastructure and deliver those differently, right? 2, 3, 4 years ago, a lot of that was vaporware. A lot of that was sort of talking about the emerging space, but it's pretty widely assumed or agreed upon today that it's accelerating and it's here now, right? This is just a Google stat, I'm sorry, a Gartner stat that shows that, you know, by 2014, upwards of 90% of IT infrastructure or IT departments will be running some sort of a cloud model. In this case, it was private clouds, but really it's going to be leveraging cloud technologies in some way or another. It's accelerating, it's here today, and people are starting to really wrap their brains around the idea that it's not just slide decks anymore, the technology's here now. So that being said, you know, if this sort of cloud stuff is changing my IT model and how I'm going to be delivering these IT services, then which model should I choose? As I look at the things that are starting to emerge, what are my choices and sort of what are the things I need to be thinking about and keeping in mind? So the first thing to understand is all of these shifts, all of these technology, all these things we're talking about is really targeting towards the middle layer of the stack, the application layer. Because at the end of the day, this is what drives revenue for companies. This is where businesses make their money. right? Most of us in this room are in IT, right? And we look at the technology pieces under the covers. But at the end of the day, the reason why we're driving IT is to support the lines of business above that are running on top of that infrastructure. And if you look at things like, I always use things like JP Morgan Chase, right? They're not in the business of binding LUNs. They're in the business of selling and managing financial services, right? Blue Cross Blue Shield is not in the business of managing IP networks. They're in the business of selling healthcare services. Unless you're a major telecom or you're a managed services company, IT is not where the company itself makes their revenue, right? They do it by creating new products and services and delivering those products and services to their customer base. And all of that is done at the application layer, right? How do I build these new products and services and deliver those up stack? So when you put it from the perspective of the business itself, the stuff down below, the infrastructure stuff, that is really just a necessary evil. Right? It's the thing that you need to provide the services for my business units to make products and services, but at the end of the day, it's not my core business. So it's our job as IT vendors and IT people and staff to make sure that we make that infrastructure as seamless, as invisible, as integrated, as automated as possible. And all of this is towards that end game. That is what all of this virtualization and cloud is really driven towards. Now, the next thing to understand, though, is those people that are building these products and services, they're reacting to another major shift in the market, and that's what's happening at the end user device level. Right? This explosion of commodity end user computing is driving a huge amount of change from the business perspective. Upwards of 60 to 80% of all applications will be rewritten in the next 3 to 5 years, and all of that is in reaction to either the commoditization of computing or sort of big data analytics that are emerging. So let me ask a question on commodity devices. How many in the room here have a smartphone of some kind? That's what I thought. How many of you have a tablet of some kind? How many have a laptop of some kind? How many of you have all three of those with you this week? And how many of you have used all three of those already today? A good 20% of this room have already used all three devices, and it's not even 10 a.m., or it's just about 10 a.m. That's the world that we live in. That's the world that our businesses live in. And what they're realizing is that these products and services that they're developing at the application tier, they need to be able to, if they want to reach their target marketplace, they need to rewrite applications that can deliver that to whatever devices and whatever anybody's hand is at whatever time of the day. And that's the pressures that they're under that we as IT people need to help them support and drive. Right? And that's what's doing a lot of this. Now, what's happening that a lot of IT people are not aware of is they're starting to see this separation occur between the business and the IT layer underneath. All right? And what I mean by that is this. The business people realize that they make their money by creating products and services and getting that to as broad a market as possible and getting to their customer base. And that's their focus. Historically, the IT departments in most companies have had a monopoly over the infrastructure on which that stuff ran. All right, the infrastructure, the cloud infrastructure, the ubiquity of networking didn't exist yet a couple of years back. And so you had to build out IT departments to do that. All right, and I'm not saying they're going away. They are absolutely here to stay, guys, right? What I'm saying is businesses are starting to realize that they can start shopping around for the IT services that they're going to use on which they're going to write their products and services that they're going to try to sell to make money in whatever industry you happen to be in. So what's happening is that there's a competition starting to happen between the cloud provider space, the Googlezons, since the name of the deck, the Googlezons of the world, and the core IT departments that they've traditionally leveraged. All right? And a lot of IT people aren't necessarily hooking on to the reality that that is starting to occur, that the business people are saying, I can get my stuff serviced here by core IT like I always have, but there's choices out there now available to me that didn't exist even just a couple of years ago, and as a business person, I need to start looking at that. So what I'm going to talk about mostly in here is understanding that's the drivers that's happening in the industry. How do we now sort of live within that new reality? So is this inevitable, first of all? Is this competition inevitable? Is this drive of the business layer looking at other ways of servicing the infrastructure to run these applications on? Is this going to happen? And the easy answer to that is to say yes, but to say that this is the way capital markets work, right? Back in the day, everybody kind of had their plot of land. If you came to the United States or the Americas back a couple hundred years ago, you got 20, 30, 40, 100 acres of land, go farm it yourself, farm your food, and sustain your family, right? Nobody does that these days. Right? Yes, there's a sort of back to the basics. A lot of people here might have a plot of land in their yard, or they go to farmers markets. But for the most part, the vast majority of where we get our food is here, right, at a supermarket. And if you go into your typical supermarket, there's 10,000 different brands in that supermarket. Not 10,000 items, 10,000 different kinds of things you could possibly buy. All right, that's a pretty big amount of different types of foods and things that you can get at. Now, all of that, however, if you look at the food services industry, has over the last several years consolidated down to just 10 brands. All right, every single thing you can find in a grocery store rolls up to just 10 companies. Consolidation, that's just the way it happens. Now, that's not just in the food industry, of course, right? That's also true in the wireless and the telecom industry. Right? Over the last several years, you've seen consolidation down to basically 4 wireless companies. And hey, it was almost 3 until AT&T wasn't allowed to do their most recent merger and acquisition. Right? It's true in the airline industry, where now we're down to basically 6 core carriers in the Americas. And of course, we're all aware of this one. It's true in the financials industry, right? Where you've gone from dozens of banks to basically 4 behemoths in the last couple of years. And I'm not saying that this is always a good thing, but this is the way markets drive towards lots of individual islands, and then drives towards efficiencies and simplicities, hopefully over time, towards smaller numbers. That is the way business people think and the way they're going to be trying to drive efficiencies. Now, that doesn't necessarily, like I said, make it mean that everything is going to go towards Amazon or everything is going to go towards Google or Microsoft or others, but the natural inclination of business drivers is to go that route. All right, and that's what we need to be keeping in mind. So thanks for that pep talk that everything's going to be going elsewhere. So what do I need to keep in mind when I'm thinking about that? And that first thing is to understand what your options are. Right? What is it that's happening out there, and what types of, not internal, external, hybrid, private infrastructure platform, but what are the higher sort of cloud options that are emerging? So this is where we get to the second piece, which is choices. There's really 3 types of models that are emerging. The first model, which probably almost everyone in this room, if not the majority of people in this room are doing, is really sort of the build your own cloud model. Right? This is more of the traditional, what we've seen over the last several years of building virtualized infrastructure, maybe even throwing some portals or automation tools on top of that. So, you know, Chris was just talking about putting vCloud Director, and then for more advanced, you might be getting up to Service Manager and front-end portals and orchestration stuff. But at the end of the day, what you're really doing is you're applying technology and building a technical solution. And for most of us in this room as technologists, that's the way we think. We solve problems with technology. We solve problems with things. That model is really more of the virtual data center model. All right? And if you think about it from the previous sets of slides, most companies are really, if you peel the onion back, you're throwing technology at what long-term is really more of a business problem. The business problem is, how do I source the IT services on which I build my products and services that I make money and compete in my particular marketplace? So the business drivers aren't necessarily rooted in a technology solution, but that's typically how IT shops are building out their internal clouds. The second model that's, of course, emerging rapidly is that public cloud space. And more businesses are saying, well, I've been putting a lot of money towards core IT, and I'm getting certain efficiencies. I went from 1-to-1 to 5-to-1 to 10-to-1 to 50-to-1 consolidation ratios, and there's certainly efficiencies built into what I've done. But hey, these guys over here are saying, why are you even talking to your vendors about multi-$100,000 or $1 million storage arrays or server platforms or network platforms when I can sell you storage for as cheap as 8 cents a gig, and you just pay it as you consume it? Why are you wasting your capital on doing that when you can just pay as you go with me? And some business people are starting to listen to that. I have a question. How many people in the room know that their company is using at least some form of public cloud for some pieces of the business? That's a fairly good number, right? And I'd be willing to bet that half of you that didn't have your hands up, they might be, or at least they're looking at it, right? And that's only going to accelerate. Now, the third model that's emerging is this middle model. You've heard about hybrid clouds, right? And this is the idea of IT departments that are saying, look, if I continue to basically do what I'm doing right now and businesses slowly move towards that consolidation model of the Uber clouds or the Googles on clouds, right? Eventually what IT turns into is a broker, but not a broker of any services, but simply brokering contracts with these cloud providers. So the middle ground area is really saying, hey, look, rather than me being an IT department and Amazon offering an IT department for choices for the business to use, Why don't I realize that by competing for that business, what I need to do is become a business, right? And be the point of contact for my line of business and application owners. So when they say they need IT services, I broker that conversation. And those things that should run in the cloud will. And some of the things that shouldn't run in the cloud and should run internally will. But I can be that central point of control to which the business comes to ask for these IT services. And that's more and more where customers are starting to move and realizing it's not just a technology thing. And we come to conferences like this and we think about technology pieces and we think about the bits and the bytes and the how do I get this, that, and more efficiency out of different pieces. But at the end of the day, what we need to realize is that, again, that is the technical piece, but we need to be able to broker the right services to the business based on what they need. So as a lot of people don't realize how quickly this stuff over here is growing. Walking too far away. So Amazon's and Google's and Microsoft's very much are a viable option that's growing. If you look at the numbers, this year it's not a broken out number. It still fits in the other category for Amazon. But Amazon Web Services represents about a $2 billion business this year. And that's growing at 200% annual. All right, so to put that into perspective, being an EMC guy, Amazon's web services are growing 20 times faster than EMC is. All right, and we're growing at double digits 10 straight quarters. I mean, we are growing very, very rapidly, and yet they're growing 20 times faster than us. Yes, it's only 1% of the overall IT industry, but it's growing quite rapidly. All right, now that number can be a little skewed, because if you made $10 last year and you made $20 this year, that's 100% growth. So they're a small number, but they are growing very, very quickly. This stuff over here, the way most IT departments that I talk to and a lot of us are working with, their reaction to a lot of this is this. Ignoring the problem, right? Not wanting to realize that that's happening out there, or yeah, but it's not really secure, or it's not really trusted, or if I ignore it long enough, it'll go away and I won't have to worry about it, all right? But what people kind of need to realize is that if we continue to go this route and we don't embrace the goodness that is out there and become that middle ground, that broker of services ourselves, that product will die. This idea of building just a technical solution is going to lose out in the long term to consolidated big Uber clouds if we don't own the conversation with the lines of business along the way. All right? So this is the thing that we need to realize, and what we're asking a lot of people out there is, are you going to compete for that service? Are you going to compete and become a provider to your line of business and broker the conversation? What things should belong in the cloud, and some things honestly should, and what things should belong internally, and that most things probably should, and we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, so what does Google's on say? What is so attractive about these guys? Right? So they're going to go out and they say, you know, why would you own for life when you can rent for pennies per hour? Right? Why go out and spend millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands or whatever it is on infrastructure when you can just pay pennies as you consume? Right? Why go out and build that big, beautiful backyard pool that'll cost you $80,000 to $100,000 with waterfalls and sort of nice landscaping and all that stuff when you're only going to use it a couple days of the year? Us up here in New England, you only got a 3-month summer. I know I'm in there as much as I can in my parents' pool, but why do that when, you know, for $20 a day, water's warm. It's good enough for one. It's good enough for all. Right? Just come on in. Water's great. Right? So why the $100,000 investment when you can pay $20 a day when it's 100 degrees outside? That's really what they're selling, right? Now, by the way, there's ups and downs to both of those, but, you know, this is what's going on. So then they say, okay, and by the way, it's easy, guys, right? We provide low cost of entry, right? We provide elasticity. You can grow up, you can scale back, you can pay as you consume. It's open, it's flexible, you can do all these things. And by the way, no matter how much mud those vendors are throwing at us about security and compliance and all that stuff, we're PCI compliant, we're FSMA compliant, we're HIPAA compliant. We've got all of that. Don't worry about it. We're good. Right? And by the way, over the last couple of years, the services we offer have exploded. Yeah, AWS back in 2007 was more of a beta of this idea. But over the last couple of years, we've got huge numbers of offerings, from platform offerings to infrastructure offerings, backup offerings, pretty much you name it, database as a service, data systems, business intelligence as a service. It's all out there if you want to consume it. Right? And by the way, did I tell you it's cheap? Right? We can get it to you as low as, 8.5 cents per gig. So swipe your credit card. Come on in. Let's start up. If you boil the pitch down, that's basically it. Why spend a lot? Water's warm, come on in, pay as you go. By the way, we're secure too, elasticity, all that stuff. But let's take a little bit of a closer look at this. So behind the covers, what are some of the details? And by the way, it's a really good story, and B, a lot of use cases, it is the right use case, all right? But sometimes it's not. So take a look at this a little bit. We'll use an example of a sort of application that's, you got an app, it's 300 gigs, and it's, running some sort of a load on this. So the app's got 200 IOPS, it's 300 gigs in size. It's about 10 gigs per month, right, for capacity, right, if you're using the sort of middle ground on pricing, and 13 cents per gig for transfer. By the way, when you bring information into it, it's free. You can bring in data in, no problem. It's when you access that information that will charge you for the egress of that info, right? So if you look at it, it's about 30 bucks a month for that storage alone. For the performance of the I/O, right? If you've got a 70/30 read-write app doing 20% of the time the database is active, you're going to be looking at about $1,800 a year, or about $150 a month for the data access portion of this. So all in, it's going to run you about $2,200 a year for that 200 gigs of space. Right? Now that does not include puts and gets and lists and those types of things, and that doesn't include the cost of the actual operating system, the virtual machine itself that's running on AWS versus the S3. But it's an idea of sort of where this comes in. For steady state workloads that are always there and always running, this is actually kind of a pricey way to do things. Now if you're only going to need it for a couple of hours to do some testing, it's a fantastic way to do it, and it's vastly cheaper than you can offer it internally. All right? So there's use cases in where this does apply. From an SLA perspective, whoa, you just saw a lot of it in the last session. But the good news is that we don't really have any performance SLAs. Everybody's got the same one, right? From an availability perspective, 3 nines of availability, right? That's pretty good for a lot of people, but that comes down to about 10 minutes a month, a week that it's going to be down. Obviously, things don't usually go down 10 minutes a week. It's usually up for months on end, and then you're down for a day or two. But that's something to keep in mind. To what Chris was saying in the previous session, for those of you that were here, that means that from an application perspective, you need to make sure that you're building your apps correctly to be able to span multiple zones, to be able to handle that resiliency and availability. All right? So you have to build that into the application layer if you need more than the 3 nines. By the way, that 3 nines exists pretty much across the industry. Everybody's standardized on that. It's true for Amazon, it's true for Google, it's true for Microsoft. Until you get to sort of the Terramarks and others that are really targeting enterprise class cloud marketplace, that's when you're going to get into the sort of 5 nines types of options. At the end of the day, when you look at these 3 nines of pieces, it really turns into an insurance policy, right? But you only have insurance, 4 or 5 days a week. You don't have it all the time. Sometimes you might have to deal with it being down. Taking a look at one more thing before I move on is to look at sort of this type of a picture. Most people like to talk about this romantic idea of the power grid, that this is all going towards the same thing the power industry did 100 years ago, that you just plug it into the wall and you get electricity, and that's what data and compute's going to be in the future. When I plug my cable into the wall, I just get compute on demand. The thing to note, of course, is that they use pictures like this to do this sort of pretty sort of nostalgic look into the past. If you change that angle a little bit, it looks more like sort of armies marching in, right? Because at the end of the day, although the compute itself is absolutely becoming a commodity, the stuff you're doing with that compute isn't, right? The stuff you're making, the stuff you're building, the stuff you're programming, that is the business value. That is the intellectual property that you're eventually going to sell or market to your customer base in whatever industry you're in, right? So we need to be thinking and keeping that in mind. Although the compute itself may be a service, the stuff you're making with it and where that lives and resides in lifecycle and data protection and all that stuff, that's not a commodity, right? That's my business, and we need to just keep that in mind when looking at these things. So will you compete for the business is the question, right? Are we going to let it go to these providers, or are we going to say, hey, I'm not just going to be the technology house, I'm actually going to be a consultant to my business to help broker these conversations? And so what are the actions to take around that? So the first thing is to realize is that it's not just about technology, right? It's the classic people, process, technology piece. So breaking that down, I'll do one thing on the process side of it. We need to become businesses. All right, so that means we need to think in service levels. That's why Chris kicked off the day with his keynote talking about SLAs and service levels. It's in the top of everybody's minds right now. We need to be having those conversations and brokering those conversations with the business. But it's not just about availability and it's not just about performance. It's really having conversations around What are your business drivers? What are your pain points? How do you make money? And then how do I provide the IT services to help you achieve those goals? Right? It's not just can I get 5 nines of availability, can I get 10,000 IOPS or whatever it is from the infrastructure. So service-based pricing, service-based mindsets, SLA mindsets, integrated with governance and risk. You know, when you look at governance conversations, that's not really about technology, but technology provides a lot of the insight and audit control that provides the feedback to those teams. From a technology side of it, what are the enabling pieces there? And this is a classic picture you're probably familiar with, at least in general, is that you've got your sort of public and private cloud apps layer and end user layer. What we as IT people need to do is start building this out so that you've got your private cloud, right? You've got your internal cloud offerings that offer services. You leverage the public cloud not as a replacement of, but an augmentation to IT, right? For those services that need elasticity, those things that are going to be short-lived, that aren't steady-state workloads, I need to leverage cloud providers potentially for that, especially in the long term. I need to work with my application owners and business owners to identify which applications am I going to simply containerize, my SAPs, Exchange, SQLs, Oracles, Sybases, all those things that are in my legacy world, containerize those as applications or as vApps and run those on this infrastructure, and which applications need to be rewritten, replaced, or just built cloud ready day one in this next generation type model, right? One of the biggest things about next gen apps is this separation of the app layer from the data layer. Right? So how many in the room here are familiar with what's happening with Gemfire and SQLfire and SAP HANA? Couple hands go up, right? You're starting to see this sort of data grid layer emerging that separates the app layer from the infrastructure layer or the data layer. Because when you look at cloud mobility and application portability, it's really simple to remove a 50 gig app. It's the 2 terabyte database that has to come with it that makes cloud portability so difficult. That is the legacy side of this in building applications. A lot of these next-gen apps that are going to be built completely different, where the data is independent from the app, making the app fantastically portable. And then these data grid layers, by things like SQLfire and others, actually provide the data services and mobility across sites. Right? I can't get into the details on that in this time frame, but that's where a lot of that's going. Now, IT ends up managing all of that. I manage the conversation around what should be internal, what should be external, which apps should be virtualized, which apps should be rebuilt, and then I deliver those services to my end users on whatever device it is that they're using to consume those IT services or products, right? Now, the key thing to make this successful is that we need to right source the applications. We need to look at the apps that our lines of business are using and help them identify which ones should we house and which ones should they or somebody else house. I will broker that conversation. I will manage the movement of that information and placement of that information, but we need to figure out where it's going to be most economical and meet your business needs. So this is a very common exercise that many, many teams are doing right now, and they're working with their business units to look at all of the applications and figure out where should they be hosted. One of the first screens you kind of look at is the economic assessment. Can the cloud do it cheaper than me? And, you know, as IT people, we want to always say, hey, we can do it better, we can build it, we can be more efficient. But at the end of the day, there are going to be use cases where cloud providers can do it cheaper. It's just a reality that we live in, right? They have economics of scale that smaller companies don't have. It gets to the next question then is the trust assessment. All right, great, they can do it cheaper, but does it meet my compliance requirements or my regulatory requirements? That's where most of these fail, right? An example would be something like the state of Colorado, where they said, hey, we're going to go ahead and move all of our email to the cloud, right? We have this government initiative to cloudify as much as we can. We're going to move everything from Exchange to Gmail. And about 6 months later, they realized that there's this small little thing that's called the Freedom of Information Act. And when somebody makes a discovery request, where does that information live? Who owns that information? Whose infrastructure is that on? How do I get access to that? And all of a sudden they realized that they didn't do this type of an assessment. It failed that second screen and should have come back in. It did end up coming back in-house as a result of that. Now, that's government with big, massive regulations around it. For a lot of people, that would fly right through that screen, get to the next layer, which is the functional assessment. Does it actually meet the need of the business? And if I can do all of those, if they can do it cheaper, if they can meet my compliance requirements, and they meet the functional need of that particular workload, I'd be doing a disservice to my company to not run it in the cloud, right? I would be basically getting in the way of making that business additional value, right? So I need to allow them to put it out there, but I need to broker that conversation and manage that movement. So there's kind of two things you look at when you're getting to that app rationalization. Some of those when you're looking at the applications, some of them will get sort of application virtualized and packaged, right? This is porting it, sort of just P2Ving it, running them as in VMs. And some of them will get modernized, right? And some of them will get rewritten and recoded to be cloud aware on day one. Now, when you take those applications, those that need to be run in-house, we decide that they fail one of those screens, how do we actually deliver that? All right, and hopefully some of this is a review, but what are the things we need to think about here, right? You've got these constituents that need to be thinking about how do these systems work together. You've got customers that want self-service, and I don't mean customers like the business's customers, although in some cases it could be. I'm meaning more the lines of business that are consuming IT. They want to be able to check out a VM, check out a development framework, check out something as easy as it would be to check out a book. But you got management that want to be able to track, monitor, control that, make sure that, that it's meeting my needs, to make sure that it's financially sound, all that fun stuff. You've got control and governance teams whose job it is to reconcile those two demands. Right? Build the service catalogs, monitor those service catalogs, approve or deny service requests. Once they're approved, you've got operations teams, core IT, that's now responsible for delivering those services, right? And then you've got the stuff in the middle that gets actually provisioned. Walking you through the basic process of how it would work, right? You need to have portals. We're going to be moving away from manual control of all this stuff. Gone will be the day of a person binding a LUN, allocating a LUN, managing IP addresses, assigning those, installing an operating system, tuning that operating system. A lot of that stuff is going to be done by policy engines, and a lot of what's going to be moved up is the portal and control over how we actually monitor those policies, right? So the first thing that might happen would be a portal would come up for my line of business owner to request a machine, or request some code to work on, right? So they go into something like Service Manager, although there's lots of portals out there, right? And they do a checkout system. They pick the things that they want and they make the request. That goes to the governance team that's basically going to take a look at that and say, all right, do I approve or deny this request? In many cases, what we're finding is that early on, and I'll talk about the phases of adoption in a little bit, people are starting to rubber stamp some of these requests. Look, if you meet these basic requirements, if you pick from one of these 3 or 4 templates, you get it right away. Nobody even has to approve it. All right? Now, you may only get it for 30 days, and then you've got to re-request or extend that lease, but you can have it right now in 3 to 5 minutes, right? Or if you don't want to, if you take something outside of the norm, we'll custom build that for you. Once it's been approved, though, it gets passed on to the operations guy. Operations person takes the request and says, all right, does that infrastructure exist? If so, go ahead and provision it. If not, I need to go ahead and provision the physical infrastructure required to meet that service request. And if that happens, you've got portals and processes that do that. Now, in the example here, I know it's an eye strain for you guys out there. This case is something that is an EMC thing in the VCE with vBlock, right? But it's really true across any piece of the products in the industry. You've got orchestration tools that you've got here that then reach out to element managers to actually create more ESX servers, add more LUNs, apply new networking to this to be able to build out the infrastructure. And once it's done, at a portal layer, the IT guy says, all right, go ahead and provision the services. And Service Manager and vCenter Orchestrator and Cloud Director and Virtual Center all work together to now deploy those templated VMs and provide that to the end user to start using. If you notice in that process, nobody's actually in Virtual Center, nobody's actually in Cloud Director, nobody's actually in a Unisphere or a UCS Manager or anything like that, right? Those are all built in the architectural phase to design the policies, and the actual IT staff are working in portals for requests, approvals, and deployments, all right? And then monitoring the results of those SLAs. I use this as an example of what happens in the airline industry or in planes, right? Just because everything is fly-by-wire systems doesn't mean you don't have pilots out there flying those planes, right? It just means that they're not pulling the lever that pulls a cable that lifts the elevator that turns the plane, right? They're monitoring systems, and fly-by-wire systems fly that complex piece of equipment, right? But you still need to have those pilots monitoring and controlling the actual policies and systems themselves. If you break this down and try to simplify it a bit, this picture here really falls into 3 key things. It falls into the service catalog and presentation layer. This is the thing that you build that is your interface with your IT consumer, right? How they interface and interact with you. There's the process, workflow, and delivery automation layer. That's the IT stuff. That's the orchestration layer and the IT portals that you use to manage IT infrastructure. And then there's the infrastructure management and cloud API. That's the physical tier. That's the physical things and the APIs they provide for the orchestration tools to automate all these processes. All right? And if you do these first two right, if I can have a consistent interface to my business and a consistent set of interfaces that I as a staff use to manage those policies, the infrastructure becomes interchangeable, right? If that orchestration and that portal and policy engine tier can be consistent, the infrastructure side of it, whether it's stuff that I own or stuff that I lease, and from any vendor I choose to buy from, become interchangeable parts, right? And that's really where the front end of this is where, in the short and long term, we really need to focus. Getting that stuff in place, and then we have tons of choice going forward as to how and where things are deployed. Now, for those workloads that we do choose to keep in-house, how do I assemble that stack? I'm going to use one example, right, of the service catalog, the process workflow, and private cloud to show you how you can actually, from a dollar perspective, compete with the providers that are out there. Again, I know that I've got the VCE stuff on me, so I'll use that as the example, but this is looking at a fully managed platform of dollars per VM per month over a 3-year TCO. Right? Amazon is going to say they can sell you this for a typical mid-sized server at about $250 a month. Now, using the VCE vBlock solution, and this is the only, I don't mean this to be a commercial, it's an example though, this is true across many of the infrastructures out there. As you scale this up from small to large, right, 200 VM deployments up to 2,000 VM deployments, efficiencies get higher as you go up there. All in, inclusive of VMware Service Manager, vCloud Director, chargeback tools, infrastructure tools like UIM, and implementation services and support for that 3 years, you can do that for a much lower price for steady state workloads. If you look at these numbers, it's anywhere between 40 and 80% cheaper than Amazon or a Google or a Microsoft could provide. Now, the key thing to note is that's for steady state workloads running 24 hours a day. It's core business applications. If this was stuff that we're going to be up and down and short term in projects, and I'm going to have this just for a week to play with it or for a day to do a demo or to test some code, these efficiencies start going back up, right? So there are use cases where the cloud provider can do it cheaper. But if I'm designing for my core business steady state workloads, you can do it significantly cheaper by buying, just like with a car, right? I was in Detroit yesterday and I rented a car because I was over there. I'm not going to buy a car. I'm going to lease it for a day and I'll pay 30, 40 bucks. But then I flew back to Boston, got into my car and drove it up here, right? If I'm going to own a car for a long period of time, it's always cheaper to own and maintain it than it is to rent that on a day-to-day basis, right? And that's the same thing is true with IT. If it's my core business, if it's my steady state workloads, you can build it and manage it cheaper in-house. But there are uses where you can't, and going out of house is better. So if you do get those workloads, the ones that went through that assessment, they can do it cheaper, they meet my trust requirements, and it functionally meets the need. How do I federate what I'm doing in-house with what my providers might offer me, so that although I may use off-prem resources, I still control that centrally and manage centralized control and command over that whole thing, right? I had a customer back in 2008 say to me, hey, my dream is that I can use cloud providers and I can run my VM here or I can run it there, but I maintain control, I maintain data protection, and I maintain recovery of that. Because I don't want to have their site go down and at 3 a.m. be twiddling my thumbs feeling like I have no control and I'm waiting for them to recover. I want to be able to control the disaster recovery, right? And I added on top of that in security too. But the funny thing was, this was 2008, right? I was like, that is a fantastic dream. That doesn't exist yet. That stuff does exist today though. So if you wanted to do this and use some piece of the public provider, how would you do it? And extend that box to include the public domain. Again, if I can have this and this in place, I don't have to change the interface my business has with me. I don't have to change the tools that I use every single day. I just simply choose where I run my workloads, internally or externally, if you have a common framework. And this is where things like vCloud Director and vCloud Connector start coming into play, right? Because if you go to VMware or vcloud.vmware.com, they will help you find connect to providers, and then manage those provider tenant workspaces in which you will run your workloads, right? How many of you have actually been to this website? I'm guessing very few. I don't see a single hand. All right. If you go to this website, VMware's portal, what you get is this picture of the globe. Pick your continent. Where do you want to run your workloads? You click on it. It comes up with a list of all of the service providers in that geo that leverage vCloud technologies. You then go ahead and pick the service providers. It gives you information about them. What are their service offerings? What are the technologies they use? Do they match my technologies, right? And then you can actually, in some cases, test drive them, right? For some of those providers, you can actually fill in your information. And I know you can't read it, but this says, what do you intend to do? I want to test a hybrid cloud. What's your evaluation time frame? 3 to 6 months, 0 to 3 months. What's your implementation time frame? When do you think you might roll this out? Then they'll actually give you infrastructure on which to play around and try it out. Right? Now, how do you connect into that? And that's where vCloud Connector comes into play. How many of you are using vCloud Director today? As I can see, just a couple of hands. All right. vCloud Connector allows you to federate your management framework with their management framework so that you can actually control that tenant workspace in which you might run workloads. And it looks to you something like this. I know it's an eyesore with how far away some of you guys are. But what you're seeing up here is a single pane of glass, and it's your pane of glass. You can see your data center, which is this red box, and their data center, which is this red box. So much like going into Virtual Center, I'd be able to say, hey, this data center A, B, and C of mine, site 1, 2, and 3. Oh, by the way, here's AT&T's data center, and Terramark's data center, and BlueLock's data center, and Savis's data center. And I can choose within my pane of glass, do I put my VM here, 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 or here? And by the way, if I don't like it there anymore, I can power it down, bring it back into mine, power it back up again. Notice I said power down. It's an offline move today, right? But I can actually choose where to deploy those workloads, and I can change my mind later. And because it's all based on vSphere technology, I don't have to convert anything. I don't have to do anything. I just basically bring it over here and power it back up, and it's going to get the services it needs, right? What can vCloud Connector do today for you guys, right? So first of all, there's 2 use cases now. One is this portability or data center extension, where I can take a workload and I can move it to a cloud provider. All right, it does require power down, move the data power up, so it's offline, but I can do that today. The other use case for this is sort of content sync or template synchronizing between data centers. This could be you to your provider, but it could simply be between you and multiple data centers of yours, where you could actually use this tool to make sure that your templates are the same everywhere, right? And it's consistent across all of your locations so that when I bring up a Windows 2000 and whatever server, it's exactly the same every single place where I'm going to bring that up. All right? Where this is going, and I'm purposefully using tomorrow versus timeframes and dates, but it's not that far away, is cloud bursting. So cloud bursting is that promise of being able to monitor the utilization of those services, and when utilization goes up, simply spawn additional workloads either in other data centers of yours or into that cloud workspace, and then when the usage goes down, automatically delete or reduce that count, right? So that's the classic end of quarter processing. That's the classic, the day after Thanksgiving and everybody starts buying clothes, and so L.L.Bean or whatever retail all of a sudden spawns up new services. There's technologies around load balancing, other things required there, but that's where this is all going, okay? Remember, note it says tomorrow, but that promise is in the very near future. And lots of services. Just like Amazon said, we've got all these service offerings. All of those providers that you can pick off that website, storage as a service, backup as a service, compute as a service, archive as a service, backup as a service, you name it, they offer these if you want to leverage those. Just like what the Uber clouds provide. That brings us down to the final piece, which is DNA and skills. What do we as staff and what do we as IT people need to be thinking about, and what's changing in IT departments? So there's sort of this evolution that's underway right now, and we've been seeing this over the last couple of years, this trends in IT staffing around new sort of feature functionality of people, right? You've still got your traditional sort of silos in many bigger companies. You've got your systems teams, your storage team, your backup team, your network team, your security team, and you've got your different sort of siloed groups. In smaller companies, that might be one person, right? But in many of these mid-sized to larger companies, you still have these sort of areas of specialty. Those aren't going to go away. You still need experts because things will still go wrong. And when things go wrong, you need to have people that understand it and know how to fix it, all right? That's still going to exist. But what's happening is you're seeing emerge as these higher level cloud architects. Right? These are people that are responsible across all of the physical components to design the architecture of the technology components of the cloud infrastructure. All right? That's going back to the beginning, what we've been doing a lot of, which is technology, virtual data center builds. The next thing that's emerged in the last couple of years is that IT departments are starting to run like a business. Right? So they're competing for the business, so they need to run like a business. And you're starting to have not technologists, but actually consultants and business people on staff in IT departments whose job it is to communicate and talk with the lines of business, to find out what their business drivers and business needs are, and to translate those into service offerings. Right? So these are the guys who are responsible for building the service catalogs that the business owners will then consume from. Right? And then, of course, service management is monitoring those service catalogs. You know, we made services that we thought were going to be consumed, but nobody did, so I should remove them. Monitor the SLAs against those service catalogs. These are more business people versus technologists, but it's happening fairly rapidly. I know at EMC, I talked to our CIO a couple years ago, and he said, yeah, we're actually actively hiring systems engineers or SEs for IT, much like SEs in the field are talking to customers about products and services. We now have people staffed on IT whose sole job it is to work with our storage division, our security division, our data protection division, whatever, on how IT can service them and have that basically sales and consultative relationship in-house with the businesses themselves. All right? Now, this transformation doesn't happen overnight. Right? This isn't something that you just flip the switch and all of a sudden you're a service-oriented IT department. Right? This is something that EMC did over time. Right? So this is an example of how we did it over about a 4-year time frame. This is the classic mid to large IT department model where you've got you've got your Unix team, your Windows team, your management team, your storage team, your network team, your security team, your data center infrastructure team. And each of those sort of IT business units has their own support center, system support, storage support, NOC, SOC, etc. Maybe, if you're lucky enough, you've got a single service desk or a call center that people come in to log the tickets, and then the tickets get routed to the individual support staff. Right? So the first step we did in 2009 was we consolidated the support staff into a single center to start bringing the technologies together and have collaborative conversations between them to make troubleshooting easier as we started bringing these services together under an invisible IT. We also increased our focus on that virtual infrastructure piece because we saw that we were going to be going from the 15%, 20% virtualization we were in 2006 to today we're roughly 90% virtualized. So with that massive change, we needed to start having an increased focus there. It was more of a soft change at the time, though. The big shift started in 2010. And what happened here was we consolidated all of the infrastructure into a private cloud team. Right? So you no longer had storage guys, network guys, server guys, and everything else. You now had a single cloud architecture team designed to build that physical piece. And then we created this service management science project. What we effectively did was we created a cloud on the side of core IT. And they started saying to the lines of business, you can continue to work with IT like you always have. And if you're comfortable with that relationship, we'll continue to service you as we always have. But for those of you who are interested, we've got this portal. It's kind of like Amazon's book selling service. If you come in here, you can choose a VM, and you can have it in 30 minutes. By the way, we're going to give you small, medium, and large, give you some basic templates. But you can have it. It's free. You can have it quickly. You're going to get a 30 or 60-day lease on it. You can always re-up it if you want to, but it's yours. Or if you want to go through core IT like you always have, that's great. But just realize it's going to take us 3 to 4 weeks to get you that server, even if it's a VM. Right? And by doing that, they created incentives for the behavior to start shifting. By saying you can have it in 30 minutes or 2 weeks, you can have it free or some sort of a costing model, it started shifting people towards this portal that was good enough. And what they found was, as do most people, that 80 to 90% of all IT requests are the same. They're 1 or 2 or 4 CPU servers with a certain amount of disk or a certain amount of memory. And if I can just narrow that down to 3 to 5 templates and make it simple to consume and free, then they're going to move that direction. Now, that free piece is key here. They did do show back. In other words, they actually, when you got that server, they showed you a cost of that. Because, of course, at the end of the day, we all know IT is not free. There's a dollar associated with the things that are running back there. So they started a show back function to let them know this is what it's costing you, by the way. All right? Now, what they found was over the course of the next 18 months, more and more of the business, instead of going through core IT, were going through this model until it reached critical mass. And towards the end of 2011, the final switch occurred, where what was a science project became the interface into IT. And now the lines of business were familiar with that, or some of them are still learning it, right? But that's how they went into. The second phase of that just happened was they flipped it from a show back to a charge back model. We've been telling you for several years now this is what IT costs, and we've been exposing that to you. Now we're going to actually start charging you for it. All right? So there was baby steps towards that, though. It's not like you all of a sudden start charging for it overnight if that's not your MO. You walk them towards that. But you've trained them now to behave towards consuming IT that way, and now they want to continue to do it that way. Now you can start putting the restrictions by saying, hey, by the way, this costs money. All right? Now, one of the things that we also do, which is very interesting, is when you go to our IT portal to request services, business intelligence or platform services or whatever, EMC actually provides you, this is what it would cost to come to us, this is what it would cost to go to Amazon, this is what it would cost to go to a selection of providers that might be out there. You choose, and I'll broker, right? We offer in-house Dropbox services, but they'll also show you what Dropbox costs, what Box.net would cost if you wanted to go that route, and they will broker that if it makes sense, if that makes business sense to go there, right? But they're very transparent on that model and comparative cost. So the idea here is to say, if it's something, it's not something that happens overnight, but if you build into the model a behavioral incentive to start moving towards the desired result and then do it over time, that's how you can change that relationship from the business. So I've got a lot of IT departments that I talk to that when I talk about chargeback, they laugh at me. Like, oh, our businesses think we're free. I can't start charging them for it. That's not the way. They think we're free and that we're just a cost center to them, but it's invisible and somewhere else. And this is a way that you start floating up to the executive level that, by the way, there's numbers associated to this. Because if you fly back all the way to the beginning of my deck and you go high enough up stack out of the IT layer into the businesses themselves, they don't think of IT anymore as being just a service in-house that's part of it is part of the company, but they're thinking of it as there's now choices and options for me to go to, and a lot of those decisions are business decisions. So IT departments are learning that they need to actually present themselves in a business fashion when negotiating that relationship. By the way, there were a lot of things that we learned in that process. By no means was EMC or anybody perfect when they're building out these cloud models. So in those 4 years, we stumbled, we fell, we made mistakes, we fixed it, we found workarounds. And a lot of the lessons learned over that time frame was being monitored and tracked by our educational department. So for those of you who are interested, we actually provide an industry, it's not an EMC certification, it's an industry certification around cloud architects. What is it that you need to be thinking about or doing when you're designing infrastructure for cloud service offerings? And there's basic and there's all the way up to expert levels of that. We're actually offering that now not just through EMC educational services, but there's several colleges and universities that are offering that course load to start prepping the next generation. I've got a buddy who was telling me that his 19-year-old brother is currently in college and he's getting a degree in business analytics. And he's got another cousin who's actually dropped out of college at 19 to start a service provider. This is what a lot of these guys are thinking about, and a lot of this training is sort of the foundations for that next generation of stuff. So the key takeaways here is don't be this guy. Don't do this. The stuff is happening. Consolidation is occurring. Technology is changing extremely rapidly right now, and it's not going away. If anything, it's happening faster and faster on a daily basis. So major changes are afoot. Be aware of it, know that. Secondly, you need to choose to compete. Am I going to react to the things around me, or am I going to take a leadership position and step out there and actually make a difference and lead that change versus being a victim of that change, right? Third one is you want to lead the cloud conversation within your company. Right? Don't let the businesses start looking elsewhere and then come back to you to find out what your option is. If you can lead that cloud conversation and be the one who's raising the proposition of we should be leveraging public clouds and hybrid clouds, and we should be moving into this space because that's where industries are going, and by the way, I can provide business efficiencies for you so you can be more competitive and provide more agility so you can compete better in your marketplace, you become a value add to the business. So you want to lead and drive that conversation. Incent behavior. So as you build out the technologies, build incentives for people to use the new technology. So like I said, whether it was the way EMC did it with a sort of sandbox space that was free and fast versus traditional IT, they incented people to consume in the manner that we wanted them to move to long run. Right, so use incentives to do that. And then finally, this isn't vaporware anymore. Like I said, back in 2008, 9, and 10, when we were talking about this, a lot of this stuff was vaporware. It exists now. And you can see that in the shameless plug last slide, which is we do have labs here that you can take if you're interested in it. At EMC World, and what I mean by the technology existing today, we actually stood up 41,000 virtual machines in 3.5 days. Stood up, broke down, redeployed. The technology is here to do all this stuff. It's just a matter, do we want to actually use it? The shameless plug piece of this is if you're interested, room 127, I think we have the 8 top labs from EMC World are there. So if you wanted to take an hour and go do some hands-on labs, we do have access. It's not EMC-centric, it's VMware-centric on data protection, on infrastructure, on management. But if you're interested, you head in there and take a look. So with that, I am done. I think I might have a minute or two. If not, I got 1 minute if there's any questions. Hopefully that was informative, so the big picture context of what's happening. All right, thank you.